Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today, a clear-sighted, mocking little story awaits you, one that anticipates in astonishing ways many of the darker visions of the future dreamed up in later times. The New Utopia by Jerome K. Jerome, published in 1891. We follow a man who, after a convivial evening, falls to musing on the perfect equality of all people, drifts off to sleep over the thought, and awakens in a distant future in which this dream of equality has actually been realized, with all its surprising and unsettling consequences. Make yourself comfortable, let go of the day, and come along. I had spent a most stimulating evening. I had dined with a few very progressively minded friends at a distinguished club, and we had thoroughly enjoyed an excellent meal. The pheasant was a poem, the wine of choice quality, and when at last we sat together over cigars and a fine liqueur, we fell to talking of a subject that filled my friends with great enthusiasm, namely, the coming equality of all people and the future just ordering of the world. My companions at table were all well-to-do, educated gentlemen who had settled comfortably into their easy chairs, and with growing warmth and in the most glowing words, they described to me the glorious age that lay ahead for humankind. In that new world, they explained, there would be no more inequality, no wealth and no poverty, no privilege and no disadvantage. Everything would belong to everyone. Each would be perfectly equal to the other, and out of this equality, an undreamed-of happiness would blossom. For out of inequality, they went on, sprang all the evil of this world, all envy, all malice, all misery, and all sin. And once equality had been established, all this unhappiness would vanish from the earth. We raised our glasses and drank to equality, to holy equality, and then we beckoned the waiter and had him bring us still more of the excellent liqueur and fresh cigars. I listened attentively to my friends, and their words would not leave my mind. When I set out for home late in the night, my head was quite filled with these thoughts of a future world of perfect equality. Once home, I could find no sleep for a long while. I lay awake and pondered that vision of a new world which had been laid before me, a humanity that had at last left all strife behind and lived on in blissful uniformity. Gradually, my thoughts grew confused. They slipped over into strange images, and at last I sank into a deep, dream-laden sleep. When I awoke, I found myself in a most unfamiliar place. I lay beneath a glass dome in a high, bare, and cheerless room. Puzzled, I sat up, and presently a man came over to me, dressed in a wholly peculiar fashion, in a plain gray garb. To my astonishment, he explained that I had slept for many centuries, and that all this time I had been carefully preserved and kept. I was now in the 29th century, and the world into which I had awakened was an entirely different one from that which I had known. The man kindly offered to lead me about and show me the achievements of this new age, and I accepted his offer gratefully and full of curiosity. We stepped out into the street, and the very first sight took my breath away. Everywhere I saw people, yet they resembled one another in an almost uncanny way. All wore the same gray clothing, men and women alike, and one could scarcely tell the sexes apart any longer. All had short-cropped black hair, and their faces bore a peculiarly patient, almost mournful expression. I asked my companion in wonder why all the people looked so alike, and he explained to me with visible pride that herein lay the highest achievement of their age, in the perfect equality of all. It had been recognized, he continued, that all inequality was the root of unhappiness, and so it had been rooted out, stump and stem. I looked more closely at the passing figures and noticed that each of them wore a number, plainly fastened to the clothing. Names, my guide explained, had long since ceased to exist, for a name lifts one out of the mass and lends him something special, and that runs counter to the principle of equality. And so each person now bore only a number to mark him, and no one was permitted to raise himself above the others by a name of his own. I heard this with growing unease, yet my companion spoke of it all in a tone of the deepest conviction and contentment, as though he were describing to me the most natural and beneficial institutions in the world. We continued our way through the streets, and my companion went on explaining to me the institutions of this new world. I asked him how it came about that all the people were so alike, even in their build, for I had noticed that no one was strikingly tall or short, strikingly strong or slight. He explained to me that this, too, was the result of careful striving after equality. In earlier times, he said, it had been observed that some people came into the world with special gifts, one more talented, another stronger, one more beautiful, another more clever. And in just this had been recognized a regrettable inequality that ought to be done away with. And so, my companion went on, provisions had been made to remove this inequality of natural endowments as well. Whoever came into the world with a particularly clever head had his mind dulled and burdened betimes, so that he should not be superior to the others. Whoever was born with particularly strong, well-formed limbs had impediments laid upon him, so that he could do no more than the weakest. In this way, it was ensured that none should tower over another, neither in intellect, nor in strength, nor in beauty, and that all should be kept to the same measure. I objected, would it not be finer to make all people equal from above, all clever and strong and able, rather than leveling them down toward the bottom? My companion looked at me for a moment, almost wistfully, and confessed that this too had indeed been considered, but had proved impossible. To level downward was far easier, and so that path had been chosen. I looked once more at the faces of the people passing by us, and now I understood the patient, mournful expression that lay upon them all. We walked on, and my companion led me to a large building in which, he said, all important matters were decided. I asked him how they governed in this new world, and who made the resolutions. He explained to me that everything was decided by the majority, and indeed by the majority in the strictest sense, for on every question, however small it might be, a vote was taken. I inquired whether there was still science and learning, and he answered that this had largely been abolished, for whoever knew more than the others raised himself above them, and that must not be. And so the majority had resolved that no one should be allowed to know more than the average of all, and the books of the old time, in which so much unequal knowledge was stored, had been done away with. I asked further whether they at least passed the time with games and sport, and my companion shook his head. Games and contests, too, were forbidden, he explained, for every game leads to competition, and in competition one proves more skillful or swifter than another, and at once equality is undone again. And so there were no more games and no more contests, nothing in which one person might distinguish himself before another. I mused on this and asked how then it stood with love, whether at least one person might be allowed to love another more than the rest. But here, too, my companion set me right. Love between individual people, he said, had likewise been abolished. For when a person loves one particular other especially, he prefers that one to the rest, and that is once again an inequality. In the old time, he said, people had loved their wives and their children more than the state, and therein had lain a great danger to equality. But now, each loved all alike. That is, at bottom, no one in particular any longer. And the family, as I had known it, existed no more. We went on through the quiet, uniform streets, and the more I saw, the deeper my unease grew. I asked my companion what happened if a child were born that differed from the others, and he explained to me that strict watch was kept to see that all children grew up alike and that none stood out. They were carefully observed, and if one showed a special gift, care was taken betimes that it should not unfold. I thought of the two young parents I imagined standing proudly at the cradle of their gifted child, and of how all that was now no longer permitted, and a deep sorrow crept over me. My companion, however, spoke on unswervingly of the merits of this order. There was no more quarreling, he said, no envy, no jealousy, for where all are equal, no one has cause to envy another. There were no rich and no poor, no masters and no servants, no clever and no simple. Everything was leveled, everything equal, and in this, he assured me, lay the perfect happiness of humankind. Yet while he said this, I looked into the faces of the passers-by, and I found in them nothing of happiness. I saw only that patient, weary, mournful expression that lay upon them all, the face of people from whom everything had been taken that makes a person a special, unmistakable being. It was an expression such as a person probably wears who has nothing left to hope for and nothing left to strive for, because everything is settled and leveled in advance, and because there is nothing left in which he might differ from his neighbor. I began to grow frayed in this uniform, colorless world, and a quiet longing for my old, imperfect age stirred within me. I gradually felt wearied by our long walk through this bare, uniform city, and I asked my companion for a rest. We sat down, and I looked once more at the world about me. Everything was gray and orderly and still. There were no splendid houses and no wretched huts, for all the dwellings resembled one another to a hair. There were no adorned shops, no colorful displays, nothing to delight the eye or lift the heart. I asked my companion whether there was no art anymore, no music, no pictures, no poetry, and he answered that this had been done away with, for an artist raises himself above the others through his work, and that must not be. And so everything had vanished that a person might bring forth of beauty by his own impulse, for every such creation would have raised the one above the other. The longer I lingered in this world, the more heavily a feeling of oppression settled upon my spirit. The evening before, I had drunk so enthusiastically to equality with my friends, and now I saw where this idea, driven to the utmost, had led. Everything had been taken from people that distinguished them from one another, and with it, everything that made life worth living and made people human. In the effort to wipe out every unhappiness through perfect equality, every joy, every hope, every love, and every ambition had been wiped out as well. What remained was a gray, joyless crowd of uniform beings who lived on without aim and without desire, because there was nothing left worth striving for. I saw that these people were not happy, however much my companion protested the contrary, but that in their enforced equality they bore a deep, quiet desolation. And the clearer this became to me, the stronger grew in me the longing for my own old world, which was indeed full of imperfections and injustices, but in which each person was still allowed to be himself, with his own gifts, his own dreams, and his own unmistakable form. I sat a while longer and gazed at the gray, uniform figures, and the oppression in my breast grew ever heavier. I looked at one of the people whose expression struck me particularly, that quiet, questioning, wondering look, and all at once the thought came to me of where I had seen this look before. It was the look of a being from whom everything had been taken that might have let it be its own. I asked my companion whether there was then no possibility of escaping this condition, whether no one rebelled against this perfect leveling. He looked at me uncomprehendingly and replied, "Why should anyone rebel against perfect happiness?" And in that moment, I understood that here, there was no hope left, for these people no longer even knew that anything was missing. Along with the differences, the memory, too, had been taken from them of what had once made life rich and colorful. They knew no longing for anything else, because they knew nothing else any longer, and could no longer imagine anything else. The horror seized me at this thought. I looked about me in this endless uniformity, in this world without color, without ambition, without love, without art, without everything I had ever valued. And a despair came over me such as I had scarcely ever felt. I wanted to be away from this world, away at any price, back into my own age with all its faults and injustices, in which a person might at least still be a person, with his own face and his own heart. I sprang up, seized by the fierce wish to flee this gray prison of equality, and in my agitation it seemed to me as though they meant to lay hold of me, as though this world too wished to seize me and level me and take my own face from me, to make me like the others. In the moment of utmost distress, when it seemed to me as though this gray world meant to seize me and force me forever into its uniformity, I tore myself free with a desperate effort, and then it happened. I awoke. I lay in my own bed, in my own room, and the first thing I perceived was the warm light of morning falling through the curtains. For a moment I still lay there dazed and did not rightly know where I was, but then I grasped that it had all been only a dream, a wild, oppressive dream, born of that conversation about equality I had held the evening before. And I cannot say what relief flooded through me when I realized that that gray world of perfect equality was not reality, but only a phantom of my sleeping mind. I got up and stepped to the window, and I looked out at the street, at the world as I knew it. And how beautiful it now appeared to me in all its imperfection. There the people went their way, each different from the other, one tall, another short, one cheerful, another lost in thought. Each dressed after his own taste, each with his own face, his own name, his own life. There was wealth and poverty, cleverness and folly, beauty and plainness, all the thousand differences that make life so colorful and toilsome and wonderful. And I, who the evening before had drunk so enthusiastically to equality, now looked with quite different eyes upon this imperfect world. To be sure, it was full of injustice, full of hardship, and full of faults. Yet it was alive. It was rich. It was human. And in it, each person was allowed to be himself, with all his gifts and all his weaknesses. And I thought to myself that it might perhaps be wiser to better the evils of this world piece by piece, and to bring people closer to one another in freedom, than to make them all equal by force, and in so doing, take from them what first makes them human. With this thought, I turned from the window and went out into my day, grateful for the imperfect, colorful, living world in which it was granted me to live. That was our short retelling of The New Utopia by Jerome K. Jerome. A mocking and, at the same time, thoughtful story about the dream of perfect equality and about what would happen if one tried to realize it by force to the very end. Good night. And if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow, here at Sleepy Classic Tales.